back to another episode of Talking Point at Davis Media Access. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
And welcome back to another episode of Talking Point. Last Saturday, we saw the first global march against the guns, led mainly by high school students and other advocacy groups. Now, my question is, why do we have so many guns in our country? Is it because of the Second Amendment? Is it because of the gun lobby? Is it because of the macho culture? Or is it because of this culture of fear that has reached epidemic proportions?
I think all of those apply and more. We have an economy that is within limits focused on making the widest possible array of products available to people, and we take that approach to firearms. The other economies make lots of products widely available. What's different about ours is we don't set a different standard for firearms and make them substantially less available.
That's very true. Yes, yes. So it is a commodity.
Exactly right.
It's a commodity. And I was shocked once. I went to Nevada and I saw there was a Christmas sale of firearms,
Sure.
which
Yes.
is totally absurd.
Well, we talk a lot, those of us who work in this field, talk a lot about the fact that firearms are consumer products.
Yes.
They're, relative to other societies, an unregulated consumer product, although relative to other products here, they are more regulated. The same with ammunition. But it's key to understanding much of the dynamic here to see firearms as nothing more than a consumer product.
Yes.
There's an industry devoted to making them and maximizing sales. There are associated industries, ammunition and others, likewise devoted to maximizing sales.
Yes.
And that's what drives the market.
Yes. Well, it's very interesting, and especially for you as an ER physician who experiences or sees gun wounds, people being either wounded or dying from gun wounds firsthand, daily. What are your thoughts when you see that?
Well, first I should say I don't do acute trauma care very often anymore. That's a young person's sport, but I did do a lot of it. My first thoughts are for my patient,
Yes.
who's in pain and suffering, and depending on the nature of the wound might die. But the bigger picture question, it's actually what got me into this work in the first place, is what chain of events led this person to come to the emergency room with potentially a life-threatening injury. And one realization that I had, and lots of clinicians have had about firearm violence, is this. It's really quite simple. Most people who die from gunshot wounds die where they're shot. It doesn't matter how fast the ambulance gets them to us, it doesn't matter how good we are, they're just dead.
Yes.
So for me and us as clinicians to make the maximum inroads into the number of people who die from firearm violence, we have to keep them from getting shot in the first place. And that's what led me to the kind of work that I do.
Yes, and that also brings us to my next question, which is what is the focus of your research on violence prevention? I know that it would take ages to talk about all that you are studying, but maybe the focus, the highlights.
Well, it all has to do with firearm violence, and we are studying its distribution in our society. We're studying risk factors for involvement in firearm violence. We're studying the effectiveness of interventions.
Yes.
All of those things.
Well, especially the distribution seems to be in the news quite a bit, because there's a very small amount of citizens who own the most number of guns
Correct.
in this country. are there some myths about gun violence that you're hoping to dispel through your research?
Yes, quite a few, actually.
Good.
One is that firearm violence is primarily a crime problem.
Yes.
If we're talking about fatalities, nationwide, firearm suicide outnumbers firearm homicide by almost 2 to 1.
I read that.
Yes.
Yeah.
And other misunderstandings follow. If we think just of homicide, risk is concentrated among young men, and particularly young men of color. But for firearm suicide, which is more common, risk is concentrated among middle-aged and elderly white men. So the demographics are quite different. Another myth that we spent a great deal of time talking about is the myth that firearm violence in the criminal sense is predominantly a result of mental illness. And
Yes.
that's simply not true, stories
Yes.
about mass shootings notwithstanding. Only about 5% or less of interpersonal violence is primarily attributable to mental illness. Where mental illness does play a role is in firearm suicide, again more common,
Yes.
where 45% to maybe 75% of deaths are primarily attributable to mental illness. But the mental illness there is not schizophrenia, the sorts of things we're concerned about with mass shootings and whatnot. It's depression.
Yes. You know, it's a very interesting point that you make, because mental illness is cited as being the major cause of mass shootings
Right.
and other shootings, and of course by politicians especially,
Mm-hmm.
and so on. So in fact, your research and other evidence shows that that is not true. So I venture to ask you, let's pretend that a mentally ill person with a serious mental illness, whether it's depression or schizophrenia, let's pretend, what would this person do if he or she had no access to guns?
So let's
know.
assume the
Speculation.
worst. Understood. Let's assume the worst, that this person's mental illness has led them to have, let's say, suicidal intent.
Yes.
So if I attempt to kill myself with a firearm, chances are 9 out of 10 that I will succeed, that I will
Of
die.
course.
If I attempt to kill myself by taking an overdose, chances are 9 out of 10 or better that I will survive. So the name we give to this is means matter. Intent to harm oneself is really important, but given that intent, the method one chooses makes a huge difference with regard to the outcome. So I sometimes force that point in a conversation, and we'll say, look, if I could at that critical moment take the gun out of somebody's hand
Yes.
and replace it with a handful of pills,
Yes.
with all but a very few exceptions, it wouldn't matter what the pills were. I'd be doing them a favor. They could go ahead and take those pills, but we'd be able to get them back. If they shoot themselves, chances are we won't.
And this is a key point, because if I'm not mistaken, the suicidal urge is passing.
So
Very often it's just a matter of minutes or seconds, so, and then it goes away in some cases.
So that's correct. There are clearly, and let's acknowledge,
Yes.
there are people who have thought through carefully a plan to end their life. They
Yes.
have an incurable illness, lots of pain.
Yes.
We talk about death with dignity for such people, some of us do. But yes, in most cases, the urge to do self-harm is transient. It's often fueled by alcohol or some other kind of intoxication. And we know about what happens of people who shoot themselves, who carry it out, but survive
Yes.
and are interviewed.
Yes.
The vast majority of them are glad to be alive,
Yes.
sorry that they did it, not intending to do it again. And we know that of people who survive an attempt at firearm suicide, only 1 in 10 go on to commit suicide by any means. The other 90% stay with us.
We don't hear this very often in the news.
we don't have a story about suicide in the United States.
No.
We talk a lot about interpersonal violence. This is changing.
It's
But
changing
up until now,
because suicides are increasing.
that's correct. They've been
Yes.
increasing for a decade.
Yes.
And we are starting to talk more about them. And in particular, with regard to firearms, both sides of the political issue now are coming to recognize that if there is a temporary a moment in a person's life when, for whatever combination of circumstances, they're contemplating seriously harming themselves, and the people around them know that's not who they usually are, there is an effort now in several places around the country involving gun dealers and firearm ranges, not just public health and medical types, to get those firearms recovered for a brief period of time to allow the crisis to pass. And then a decision can be made about what to do with the firearms. But as one gun dealer put it, so this isn't me, this is a gun dealer.
A gun dealer, yes.
The approach is, hey Bob, you're having a tough time. How about I babysit your guns for a while? The idea is let the crisis pass. Uncouple that intent from the means that would bring it to fruition, temporarily.
How interesting. You've been an outspoken advocate, or rather just outspoken scientist, about the fact that owning large capacity magazine is much more of a serious problem than owning a gun.
Yes.
And it's definitely a terrible thing in the United States to have this large capacity magazine that can kill so many people in minutes. Do you see a way to prevent this or fix this problem?
I see a way to make it better.
Okay.
So I would agree, and some of this we've learned retrospectively. There is a unique problem associated with large capacity ammunition magazines. The problem is that they make possible what we call a high sustained rate of fire.
Yes.
And to put that in plain English, if my intent is to kill a lot of people in a hurry, I'm going to choose the hardware that will facilitate that. And a large capacity magazine is a critical part of that hardware because I don't have to reload so often.
Yes.
So California has actually had a ban on commerce in large capacity magazines for more than 20 years. Recently, the state enacted a ban on possession of large capacity magazines, but that has been held up by a court injunction in San Diego, and it's not in effect. I think whether here in California or nationwide, bans on commerce come up against the fact that there are tens of millions of these magazines in circulation in the United States.
Yes.
A ban on possession comes up against that same fact. I think a ban on possession will lead to recovery of some of those magazines, not all of them. But one of the things we come to terms with in this field is that the perfect is the enemy of the good.
Yes.
And if we can make it harder to acquire a high-capacity ammunition magazine, we'll have done a good thing.
You spoke about amnesty or buying back program, and a lot of people have spoken about this, and some of the buying back program have worked very well in Australia and in some of our states as well. What are your thoughts about that?
The kind of buyback programs that we initiate in the United States probably serve mainly as a focal point for mobilization, to bring a community together around the idea that there's something that we can do ourselves to safeguard ourselves and our children. Buybacks, as they are implemented in this country, are very unlikely to reduce rates of violence because they don't remove enough guns from circulation to make a difference.
Yes.
Australia did something completely different. We call it a buyback because people were compensated.
Yes.
But participation was not voluntary. What Australia did was require the recovery of an entire class of firearms. More than 1 million firearms were recovered in Australia. And that was not a voluntary process. It's also important to keep in mind that when in the United States we talk about the effectiveness of a buyback program, we're interested in effects on community level violence. That was not the objective of the Australia buyback program.
No, it was a nationwide ban, wasn't it?
Well, it was,
Yeah.
but it was of one class of firearms, and it was specifically, the objective of that buyback was to put an end to public mass shootings. A public mass shooting gave rise to that program
After the mass shooting
at
that
Port
they
Arthur.
had. Yes.
Exactly. And that was the objective. They have not had a public mass shooting since that buyback program went into effect. We here do not talk about buyback programs targeting public mass shootings. We have a broader objective, and I don't think we'll reach that objective if the objective is to reduce rates of violence generally.
Are the owners who are required to give up their guns compensated?
In Australia?
In Australia,
Yes, they were.
Yes.
Right.
And of course that is an incentive, but of course the federal government would have to, or the states would have to, fund this sort of operation. And that is very unlikely that people will vote for it.
That's correct.
Yes.
If we were to institute the kind of buyback that Australia had, we would face recovering and paying for tens of millions of firearms. I don't think there are good data on how many, but tens of millions is an easy estimate.
Yes.
And our culture sees firearms differently and sees the role of government differently than
Yes.
Australia does. We would not get the breadth of participation that Australia had. And I think the people least likely to participate in that program, even though they are required to do so, are also the people most likely to use those weapons to cause harm.
That's right.
So I don't think we would see the result that Australia saw.
It wouldn't be effective, probably.
Not as effective as Australia.
As Australia. Does watching sensational gun violence on TV or other media, or experiencing it in the streets, have an effect on whether you want to go out and shoot people?
So, we haven't done research on this. I'm a consumer of other people's
Are you
research on
planning
this.
to do research on this?
Probably not, because there are other people better qualified than we are. That
Yes.
field is pretty well covered. We'll stick to the things that we can do that other people can't, I think.
That's right.
But my sense from reading the research is that opinion is divided.
Yes.
That pediatricians, to pick one, find support for their contention that violent video games engender violence.
Yes.
Or at a minimum, unmask a predisposition to do violence. Other researchers disagree.
Yes.
Community violence may operate in a different way. Now, exposure to violent video games is voluntary. I go seek them out and participate in them. So people who are exposed to those games are probably different from people who are not. Exposure to violence in the community is not voluntary. It comes to you.
Yes.
So a completely separate question, and we do intend to research this, is what are the effects of involuntary exposure to violence?
Yes.
Whether it's at the very personal level, I've been shot, to the community level. What does it mean to the trajectory of a child's development, independent of everything else?
Yes.
That they grow up in a neighborhood where gunfire is part of the soundscape. Let me give you an example. I grew up in Southern California in the 50s and early 60s, and we did duck and cover drills because our society was worried about missiles coming from overseas.
Yes.
These days, there are parts of the country where children do duck and cover drills because they're worried about missiles coming from down the block. And the consequences of that sort of intimate exposure to risk over the course of one's childhood have not been adequately studied. I think it's reasonable to expect that there are consequences and that they're probably not for the better, but that's not known.
Yes.
And part of our job generally is to help society know these things so that they can do something about them.
that's absolutely right, and we can only speculate, and there's so many factors that come into how a child grows up, the propensity for violence, the intelligence, and all sorts of, so it's extremely complicated, I think.
Yes.
Women don't seem to kill with guns, so why is that? Or maybe, well, there are exceptions, there are always exceptions.
There are exceptions.
Yes.
So, rates of violence perpetration, rates of violent victimization are lower for women than for men, on average by a factor of 10. There's some splay in that number, but that's a good rule.
Well, it's a good,
it's a good rule of thumb.
Rule, yeah.
But
it's significant as well.
Yeah, so it's huge.
Yeah.
Having said that, one of the studies we did here in California was of the question, what are the risks, how are the risks for being a victim of homicide or suicide affected by purchasing a firearm? And we had unique data that are available here in California. And we knew the exact day on which people who purchased firearms could have picked them up. We followed an entire year's worth of firearm purchasers in California for about 5 years after they made their purchases. And one of the things that we found was that for women who purchased handguns, in the first year after they made their purchases, the leading cause of death, not the leading cause of violent death, not the leading cause of injury death, the overall leading cause of death for these women was firearm suicide. So rates are lower for women than for men by a factor of 10, but the pattern of risk is the same. In fact, among women who purchased firearms in that study I just mentioned, risk for being a homicide victim also went up by more than it did for men. So risk associated with firearm purchase, at least in that study, was higher for women than for men here in California.
So is it safe to assume that the buying of a gun is perhaps a tool for committing suicide by gun, because I've got one here, and so let's use it?
Yes, no question. There are two ways in which the answer to that question is yes. Number one is, as we talked about before, the impulse to harm oneself is often temporary, it's associated with intoxication and so on. It's not planned. So recourse is made to whatever method happens to be at hand.
At hand, yes.
Yeah, if that weapon is a bunch of pills, they'll probably survive. If that weapon is a firearm, they'll probably die. Separately, there are quite clearly people who purchase a firearm. I'm sorry, I should say this is an inference on my part from the data. My inference is that there are quite clearly people who purchase a firearm intending to kill themselves with it.
Yes.
And I'll give an example from that same study I just mentioned. At the time, California had a 15-day waiting period. So we knew the exact day on which these people purchased their firearm. We knew the first day on which they could have acquired it. And there were about 100,000 people in this study. It was a very large study. During the waiting period, there was no increase in risk for suicide or homicide. In the first week after the waiting period ended and these people could acquire their firearms, suicide risk was 57 times higher than expected after adjusting for age and race and sex. And we just don't see those kinds of differences in research. And to me, the only viable explanation is these people bought a gun to kill themselves with, sustained that intent over a 15-day waiting period, picked up the gun and used it.
And used it right away within the first week.
Correct.
We're coming to an end of our interview, but two things before we go. I'm going to ask you one more question, and then I'm going to let you say something, anything that you'd like.
Okay.
So you have a note in your office that says, remember why you're doing this, be patient. Oh, and for whom, sorry, I misquoted it. I should have you quote your own note. Be patient, be grateful. Why are you doing this, Dr. Wintemute?
I got into work on prevention because I was involved in treatment. And the science is fascinating. The questions are fascinating. The process of answering them is fascinating. but I'm still a physician. I still practice emergency medicine. I don't do this work in a vacuum. I do this work because people are still dying and people are still suffering. It's that simple. And I put that sign up there to remind me. Be patient reminds me that this is not going to happen overnight. It's the message I have to these remarkable young people who, over the last few weeks, have been leading a new effort.
It's a fantastic
yes,
movement.
Change will not be as rapid as complete as they would like. My hope is that all of them will stick with it for life. Some of them will become researchers, and when they do, I want them to show up here and come to work for us because we need them.
They will,
Fair
because
enough.
it's so well known here.
Yeah. And I am every day grateful for two things. One, just to have the opportunity to do this work. But for the other is because so many people from all walks of life, every day now, in one way or another, literally or metaphorically, show up at my door and say, I've reached a turning point. I'm not going to be on the sidelines anymore. What can I do to help? Some of those people are journalists. Some of those people are retired physicians. Some of those people are foundation presidents. Some of them are legislators. They want to help. And it's just a remarkable privilege to be able to be in a position of telling them what they can do.
It's wonderful, and I think the momentum is gathering.
I do too.
And thanks to these very young people.
I do too.
They're incredibly vocal and well-spoken.
Yes.
And they will be voters.
Yes.
Anything you'd like to add? I'm sorry, I'm putting you
it's
on the
fine.
spot.
I'll say this. A little over 2 years ago, there was one person with a doctoral degree in our program and 3 full-time employees. I had the doctoral degree. It's not a research degree. I'm a physician. Today, there are 10 people here with research doctorates, and there are 2 more coming in a couple of months. It's a unique moment in time, not just for us, but for the field, where there's a growing recognition that it doesn't have to be this way, and that individuals, whatever their background, whatever their capacity, can be part of the solution. So we're beneficiaries of that, but what legitimizes what we do here is that we will pass those benefits on to the public. We will gather new knowledge. We will assist in the translation of that new knowledge into effective policies and programs, and in our little way, improve the human condition.
How very well said.
Thank you.
Thank you for all the wonderful things you do for humanity and for UC Davis and for us.
Well, thank you. It is a pleasure and a privilege.
Thank you.
You're welcome.